can see who.
Okay. So now we can begin with karakia.
Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. We'll just start with karakia that is about joining together and uniting and getting ready to progress for the purpose of coming together. Mori oho, mori tu, mori ora kia tātou. Haumi e, hui e, tahi e.
Thank you. I'm not on an angle.
That means
Sorry.
Oh, she's got muted.
Yeah. Gillian, you've become muted. So if you can unmute yourself.
okay, how much of that did you get?
We didn't get the translation.
Okay. So the karakia was about joining together, life force awaken, life force stand tall, life force promote wellness, good health for all, and come together for the purpose of joining together. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Just note, friends, that this session is being recorded, and there are two hosts of this session. I'm one of them, Joanna Santa Barbara, representing the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, and my friend, Gillian. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Thank you. Called Gillian Bishop, tōku ingoa. I'm chair of Tasman Environmental Trust. Tasman Environmental Trust works with community groups to restore, enhance and protect streams, rivers, coastal margins and forest blocks. We know that many of our birds and native plants, fish and other wildlife are in serious trouble unless we take action now. So TET is about planting seeds of change and helping them grow. We want to ensure that biodiversity and ecosystems of Nelson Tasman are reliant on the face, resilient in the face of climate change, and actually that healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are an integral part of the climate solution. Healthy, resilient ecosystems can limit climate change and mitigate the impact. So we're looking to our political leaders to introduce and support policies that address climate change threats to our biodiversity and ecosystems.
Thanks, Gillian. And from the climate point of view, we see this decade, we're in 2023 for this election, we're looking to the absolute necessity of almost halving our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and who we elect in this election will matter enormously to how we progress towards those goals. And so the purpose of this evening's event is to enable you to compare policies between the candidates, which we hope will help you vote in a way that's best for the planet. To introduce the candidates, we're a bit perturbed that that Damien O'Connor is not with us yet. We hope that he will join us very soon, but we'll start with the two candidates that we have, Blaire Cameron for National and Steve Richards for the Green Party. Candidates for ACT, Kelly Lilly, and for New Zealand First, Jackie Farrelly, were invited, but were unable to come. Blaire is standing in for Maureen Pugh, who is in fact our candidate. for this area. Maureen suffered a serious bereavement just before the election period began, and Blaire is standing in for Maureen tonight. Thank you, Blaire. So we'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll get stuck right into the questions. Would you like to begin, Steve?
Yeah, kia ora koutou, Coach Steve Richards, Toka Wingua, and I'm honoured to represent the Green Party here in the West Coast Tasman electorate. I was born in Nelson and was lucky enough to enjoy childhood growing up on a farm in the Maruia Valley, south of Murchison on the West Coast. For the last 32 years, Judy and I have created and run the Jester House Cafe. It's a multi-award-winning cafe here in Tasman. And our business has always been required to, well, we've had triple bottom lining. So we've had to have a positive return for the environment, for our community, and of course our bank balance. So I understand the hard work and the dedication required to create and operate a successful small business. So you need a resilience, adaptability, and brave decision-making. They're all required in business, but equally in government. And I'm standing for the Green Party because I share a vision of a just and equitable society with abundant nature. And I see a future where we have access to warm, dry, safe homes, and where our children and theirs are well-fed and healthy. I also understand the urgency to decarbonise our economy to lessen the effects of climate change. And I believe that strong communities, food security, and clean energy are all vital aspects to a green transformation. And for the last 50 years, climate scientists have been telling us what we need to do to keep the earth safe for us to live on. And the Green Party is the only political party that's committed to listening to and acting on this advice. We're a science-based party. But we need bold and decisive action because the future does not look rosy. Pretty much every day on the news, there's another fire or another flood of biblical proportions. And only a green-led government will get our climate obligations back on track. Another science-based policy is our tax policy, which is the government instigated whatever they call it, got the tax working group to give them a report on how they should reform the tax laws, and also more recently IMF, and they both recommended that Aotearoa adopt some form of capital tax, and only the Green Party is committed to listening to this advice. And by sharing the wealth of the country more fairly, there'll be plenty to go around and support those in most need. And I'd say, just as, and finally, that we all have plenty in common. I mean, particularly in this forum, I think, but generally. And what unites us most is the desire for a safe and healthy future for ourselves, our tamariki and our mokopuna. And really the time is now, and it's getting shorter. We need to take desperate action. So that's why I encourage you all to party vote Green. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We've just heard that Damien's trying to get in, but having trouble. And Maureen, I imagine you are probably working on that. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. We'll just continue and hope that we see Damien's face soon. So Blaire, let's go to you. And
Awesome.
yeah, off you go.
Kia ora, Joanna. Ko Blaire Cameron toku ingoa. I'm Blaire Cameron. I'm the National Party candidate for Nelson. Thanks very much for inviting me here tonight. Thanks, Steve, for your introduction as well. I really like that slogan, let's get our climate change goals back on track. That's fantastic. I think that's what we should adopt at the National Party. So I'm stepping in for Maureen tonight, as Joanna mentioned. Maureen has unfortunately had a really sad family bereavement, and so where I've been stepping up to fill in for her during this campaign period in the West Coast Tasman seat, which of course is neighbouring my electorate in Nelson. But I'd just give you a bit of an introduction so you all know who I am, because I'm sure I'm a completely new face for everyone here. So I grew up in a little town called Methven, down in rural Canterbury. Like Steve, I had a bit of an agricultural background when I was growing up. Then I ended up getting a scholarship to study overseas, and then my career spent working for Princeton University, the World Bank, and the IMF, and some other international organizations in different countries around the world, across Asia, Africa, Latin America as well. Came home to New Zealand in March of 2020, and decided last year to get involved in politics, because I felt like there was a lot of things that we weren't doing so well. So, for example, Steve mentioned what the IMF said about one thing. The IMF also said a couple of years ago that the government in New Zealand and all countries around the world needed to rein in wasteful spending, because that was part of the reason that we had rampant inflation. And this government unfortunately didn't listen to that advice, and as a result we've got really high inflation, really high cost of living, and that's why one of the biggest issues this year is the cost of living and the economy. But of course we're here today to talk about climate change issues, and I'll look forward to and biodiversity issues as well, and I'm really looking forward to talking about our policies in those areas throughout the evening. So thanks very much for having me. Maureen's, I'm sure Maureen is would love to be here. She's a fantastic person who I know really, really well. And I'm sorry that she couldn't be here tonight. And I hope that I do her justice in her place.
Thank you, Blaire. Maureen, can we just ask if there's any progress in getting Damien on?
Yes, is amongst us.
I am here.
Find him here.
I'm here.
Where are you?
Oh,
Right.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
It
was a bit of a merry-go-round.
Damien,
Thank you.
welcome. I'm so glad to see your face on the
Thank you.
screen.
Yeah, it was a little bit technical glitch, which happens, but anyway, not sure where.
Yeah.
I'm here.
And your timing is quite marvelous, because the other two candidates have just introduced themselves, taking pretty precisely 2 minutes each. Well done, people. And now it's Damien's turn.
Look, Kira, Damien O'Connor, I'm the Labour candidate for West Coast Tasman. I've been an MP for a wee while, and I guess I've covered a whole range of portfolios of my time in Parliament, none of them specifically on the environment, but certainly agriculture is a big part of environmental issues actually in the country. It has been for some time, but more so lately. The West Coast is I guess a place of spectacular, West Coast Tasman, spectacular natural beauty, biodiversity, lots of water, in fact too much water often. And I guess has a small population that is strained by the requirement to provide infrastructure and support that infrastructure through council. So individuals feel quite pressured in surviving and thriving in their day-to-day lives, and the environment is something they've often taken for granted. And so these issues are sometimes seen as confrontational for them, and they've just, I guess, accepted that the environment kind of looks after itself. There's not that many of us here, and it bounces back, as it does often in the West Coast. The wider issues of climate change are slowly being understood by all New Zealanders, and our region is no different from others where there's been some debate on it, but I think the growing realisation that climate change is upon us. We have an obligation to do what we can. The question is, what can we do? And I guess that's where we as leaders have a responsibility to, with the knowledge we have, to show some leadership, to make some hard calls. And so that's where I place myself. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Damien. Thank you. I'll say a few words about the format of tonight, particularly concerning the participants. we have supplied the candidates with a list of 9 questions ahead of time. Now, these questions were generated by Nelson Tasman Climate Forum and Tasman Environmental Trust, and they were then rank ordered by those members. So the questions are in the order of importance that people attributed to them. And we will spend the first 30 or 40 minutes on those questions, which the candidates have had a chance to think about. After that, we'll get on to your questions, which you can, in the meantime, put on chat. Just go to the chat icon and word at the bottom of your screen, click on it, and you'll find a space to type in your question. So when we come to that part of the evening, Gillian and I will select from the questions submitted and put those questions to the candidates, who, as before, will have about 2 minutes to respond to the questions. How we'll warn you that you've got to 2 minutes, we'll have to do it verbally. We tried various interesting sound effects to do this, but Zoom has a great preference for the human voice. So we'll be warning you just by saying 2 minutes. So you can start typing in your questions at any time. When we come to questions from the floor, we'll put it to all of you, but you don't, the candidates, you don't have to answer every question. You can pass on those questions. The first set of questions will give all 3 of you a chance to respond. Okay, let us begin. Now that here is the top ranked question from members of those 2 organizations, and I'm putting it to all 3 candidates, and we'll start with Damien, and go all 3 of you will have an opportunity to answer it in about 2 minutes. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that to have half a chance of holding emissions below 1.5 degrees increase, we must just about halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This means, and this may at first surprise you, this means decreasing about 9% each year. What will you do to make this happen? Starting with Damien.
Okay, well, I mean, we have passed legislation that have laid down some legislated targets and some programs that force us to move through utilisation of the emissions trading scheme to generate some revenue that can be reinvested back into new technologies and swapping out some of the higher emission parts of our industrial systems for lower emitting causes and for inputs. We have been working on agriculture, which is 48% of our emissions, and inclusion of that in our target was set in 1997 by Simon Upton and the then national government. And so we've been grappling with how we would do that. The Waka Kanal was, and it was a reasonable attempt to work with the industry on what they think was the best way forward. They came back to us with a report, and we've worked to and fro with them and finally tabled our proposals that will bring agriculture into a pricing regime by the end of 2025. And that will further, I guess, encourage reduction in emissions from agriculture, which is clearly a key part of our whole emissions reduction program. If we don't move with half of them, then we're going to struggle with the other halves. In terms of transport and other areas, we haven't been doing that well, I guess, other than saying to people, you must stop driving, stop flying, and stay home. It's going to be hard in a country that is spread out. We have a small population. We have people who like to move around quite a lot, and our transport systems require a lot of emissions to shift our product from where it's produced basically to harbours and to ports and then offshore. So structurally, we have a big challenge to reduce our emissions. We have legislated for those targets. We've got to get on with it.
About 2 minutes. Thank you. Thanks, Damien. On to Blaire.
Awesome. Hey, thanks very much. So I'm 32, so I think I'm definitely the person on the screen who's going to be dealing with all these issues the most, maybe the person in the room that's going to be dealing with all these issues the most over the course of my lifetime. So what I'm really excited about is the National Party is 100% committed to making sure we meet our climate change goals, and we've got some really practical solutions of how we're going to get there. And so the first part of that, we need to be producing a lot more renewable energy. And so we are going to double New Zealand's production of solar and wind energy when we get into government, which I think is a key component of our future, of fixing the energy mix of our future, and doing that in a renewable way. Of course, transport is a major issue with climate change as well, a big contributor to our emissions profile. And we have policies that will also get our transport emissions down too. If you look at our new public transport investments as part of our Transport for the Future plan, and also in particular, the rollout of EV charging infrastructure across the country. We're going to put in 10,000 EV chargers across the country, which is going to be see us have a big shift and reducing that range anxiety that I know a lot of people have, and is holding back a lot of the population from making that shift to using an electric vehicle. Agriculture is obviously another big component of our emissions profile, and our agriculture plan is all about giving farmers the tools that they need to get their emissions down. We are going to be embracing biotechnology in order to do that, supporting farmers, working with farmers as we get their emissions down through the future. So yeah, key components there are getting transport emissions down, getting farming emissions down. And yeah, really, I'm really excited about rolling out that EV infrastructure. I know that a lot of families up here in the Nelson Tasman region that got an EV, but the infrastructure means that the lack of infrastructure across the South Island means that they also keep a petrol vehicle as well. And when we have that EV infrastructure in place, it'll mean people will be able to make that full shift to electric vehicles.
That's about 2 minutes. Thanks. Thank you, Blaire. And on to Steve.
Yeah, kia ora. So it's a frightening statistic that we have to reduce our emissions by 9% a year. In 2020, it was 7% a year. So the longer we leave it, the harder it gets. And so I'd say that we have to do everything in our power as individuals and as a government to change our behaviour. And we can do all sorts of things individually, but also there's a whole lot of systemic things that the government can do. The Green Party has a whole raft of policies, and almost all of them relate to climate in some way or another. Policies on public transport, on warmer, drier homes, loans and grants for solar panels, a plan for every Kaingaroa house to have solar panels and be completely insulated so that the people living in it are not only warmer and drier, but also they have much lower costs. And the support for sustainable transport modes, so that's public transport, but also people seem to forget that actually walking and cycling are transport modes. It's not just about recreation. And I think that for years, successive governments, no blame, have not prioritised walking and cycling anywhere near enough. And if we were to think, okay, we're going to reduce spending on roads by 9% a year and spend that money instead on walking and cycling, people would walk and cycle a lot more. And so that's a really simple thing that could happen. Rapid phasing out of fossil fuels, the coal boilers, particularly in schools and in hospitals by 2025 is Green Party policy. And supporting agriculture to make a shift to more diverse plant-based agriculture, so moving away from intensive dairy. And I guess really the most important and the most difficult is a change in the economy, to move away from a growth economy, which none of the other parties are really talking about. But if we're going to reduce energy use relates to material throughput. We have to actually be looking at reducing material throughput to get anywhere near the climate obligations that we've got.
Thank you very much, Steve. Over to you, Gillian, for the next question.
Thank you. The next question is, how will you prioritise free or low-cost passenger transport and walking and cycling over road spending? Road transport causes 16% GHG emissions in New Zealand, hundreds of deaths, community severance, air pollution, and biodiversity loss. And this time we're going to start with Blaire, please.
Sure. I just want to push back on the Green Party's idea that economic growth isn't a good thing. Economic growth is a very good thing. It means that we have the money to invest in the infrastructure that we need, and the healthcare education that we need, and in investing in technology that is going to help us meet our climate change goals in the future. So I'm a big believer in getting our economy moving and growing our economy. To go back to the question, so when we're talking about transport, and walking and cycling, absolutely we need to be supporting more walking and cycling. You'll notice that our housing policy does allow for intensification in city centres and on public transport routes, which will mean a lot more people walking and cycling, which is good, but we need to have transport options as well. And I would also note that the West Coast Tasman region, we have a lot of produce grown in the region that needs to be transported to market, whether that's going to a port or to a city, and that does need roading infrastructure. So the last few years we've seen a lot of roading projects cancelled, although I know that Labor have recently announced that they are going to go back to building roads after 6 years of not building any. And
it's just bullshit. It's just bullshit. I cannot not sit back here and intervene when things are inaccurate. I'm afraid if we're going to have a debate, we have a debate.
Damien, I'll have to ask you to wait. Wait until it's your turn. Go ahead, Blaire.
Yeah. So we will be building some key roads that we do need to get built. For example, one that will affect Tasman is the Hope Richmond bypass, and that will mean that we can get a lot more those buses, for example, will be able to will benefit from that by not getting stuck in Richmond. So it's a mix, right? You can't just go all one way. You can't just say, okay, we're only going to prioritize cycling and walking. We do need to have good roading infrastructure as well in order to get those goods to market, and in order for people to have that choice. And that's what we'll be doing when we get into government.
Thank you. Thank you, Blaire. Steve.
Yeah, kia ora. So Blaire, which part of growth is sustainable? Would be my question to you. It's at the end of the day, you have to stop growing because we're in a finite planet. But on public transport, we've got a vision of where everybody has equitable mobility freedom, and they can easily, safely, and conveniently and independently get where they want to go with a minimum of harm to the planet. And I would say that actually we need to change people's behavior. We don't need more roads. If you build more roads, you get more cars. It's so well proven all around the world. And the same with cycleways. If you build more cycleways, you get more people on bikes. When I lived in Nelson and biked to school from out well into Stoke, it was, those days it was 4 miles. And there was hundreds of kids biking to Nelson College where you were today. And now there's only a handful because it's not safe. If we reduced the car lanes to 1 lane, so it's much more difficult to car and much easier and safer to cycle, a lot more people would cycle. It's proven. So transport needs to be decarbonised, streets reclaimed from the cars, so people feel connected to their communities. Public and active transport networks need to be well connected and provide a true alternative to the car. And we want to update planning standards so that intensification can take place, but also so that any development that does happen is on public transport routes. So what the Tasman District Council future development strategy, where they're looking at only allowing development sort of Brightwater Wakefield way, where there's already a corridor for the bus and also for active transport. Also, more radically, banning the import of internal combustion engine cars by 2030 at the latest. Actually, we could do it tomorrow. There's enough cars in New Zealand now that we wouldn't need to import another one. There's 1 car for every person in Nelson. We've got the highest car ownership of almost anywhere in the world. And
It's about
if you
2
did
minutes,
that,
Steve.
all of us, no, light rail in the major cities as well.
Got it. Thanks, Steve. Damien, your turn.
Look, thank you. This is not about roading, but the reality is if you stop funding any further funding into roading as National did, then the roads became degraded and dangerous, and we have put a lot more money back in to try and bring them up, particularly if you added heavier trucks to them. We have to do both. People will want to travel around. They need to do so safely and efficiently, but we have to build also alternatives, and we have funded public transport, made it free for a lot of people, particularly in the cities, and are slowly extending that out into the provincial areas like Motueka, as we have seen with the e-bus. Growth has to be in the right areas, and growth in more sustainable ways, not just growth for the sake of it. If growth is in ever-increasing values of houses, that is not productive. And so we have to come up with some creative ideas like village development, which I'm a staunch supporter of, where we can then have efficient public transport systems. The way we're developing now in Nelson, Tasman, less so on the West Coast, is that no public transport will be sustainable over time because people are so spread out, and they then have to drive their cars or something else to get to a node where they can pick up on public transport. We have to recreate, and that's the reforms to the RMA will hopefully enable that to happen, so that we do end up with more sustainable development and growth, which is sustainable growth in the right areas, that is improving more reasonable public transport systems, improving our standard of living. Those are the areas that we should be growing, not just the value of houses.
All right, Damien. Over to you, Joanna.
Okay, the third question ranked by the members to Steve to start with. Will you transition intensive dairying to low emissions farming by phasing out synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and imported animal feed, reducing herd size and banning new large-scale irrigation schemes?
So pretty much the answer is yes, but it's not us and them. Farmers and horticulturists have to be the most important people in the community. They are the ones that keep us alive, basically. So, but we really do need to support the agriculture sector through a just transition to reduce their emissions, minimise harmful inputs and practices, and regenerate rural land and water, and to build resilience. But it needs regulation, so we need to significantly reduce stock numbers, particularly dairy cows, based on the requirements that are informed by soil type, by climatic conditions, and where they are, which catchment they're in. So, and absolutely phasing out synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Again, they're not sustainable. They're based on fossil fuels. The ammonia urea plant in Taranaki is using gas to make fertilizer. And we need to ensure that New Zealand honours its commitment to the International Methane Pledge. So also phasing out palm oil feed, introducing a price on agricultural emissions, and incorporating soil carbon and health and the soil and water health systems into the climate change response, so that farmers can be paid, if you like, for the carbon they sequester by making their soils better. Soil, particularly peaty soils, are one of the best places to store carbon, and it also makes better food if you've got a higher carbon soil. So yeah, assisting farmers to transition to regenerative farming, where they build soil and grow better food, but having a on-farm advisory service and financial tools to help them do that.
Thank you, Steve. On to Damien.
Look, thank you. I mean, we are one of the lowest carbon producers per unit of output, but that does not mean that we should stop there. And so we are bringing agriculture into emissions trading scheme, which is what, or into a pricing scheme based on prices, particularly with carbon dioxide related to the ETS. But that is one incentive. It'll be a small incentive. What we need is the signals from the market that are coming thick and fast, that say that if we can reduce our carbon footprint, we'll have an advantage in the market. So we've got to work with farmers, many of whom we have reduced slightly the gross emissions from agriculture. Some of it has been a reduction in animal numbers. Some of it's been more efficiency. And so it's moving in the right direction, but it does need to move up a notch or two. We're not going to tell people that they should reduce their herd size, making sure that there are standards when it comes to water quality. There are standards when it comes to gross emissions from their farming system, and allowing all their sequestration options to be included in terms of offsets initially, but then try and reduce them over time. I think what will mean that we have or continue to have an efficient farming system, that has reduced its emissions. There are some technologies that are coming through. We have to make sure that they're taken up by the farmers and encouraged by all the companies that currently sell and profit from their interaction with farmers. At the moment, the signals and the drivers aren't all consistent to farms.
Thank you, Damien. And to Blaire.
It sounds like you support our new biotechnology policy, Damien. That we're giving farmers new technology, more tools, so that they can reduce their emissions. It's great.
How are you giving them, Blaire? What's giving them to them?
By allowing them to uptake the new technologies that
No,
at the
you said
moment
giving. Your policy says giving.
Yeah. So we're giving them the option to we're going to embrace biotechnology, embrace these new technologies that will allow us to reduce emissions, and really driving those new technologies as part of our plan to meet our climate change goals. Look, we've had a government that has completely demonized farmers, and we're not going to make progress unless we work with farmers rather than against them. And that's what our policies are designed around. We want to move towards lower emissions farming in the future. I would note that, for nitrates example, farmers are using less and progressing. A lot of farmers are, and that's a good thing. And we need to celebrate that. And we need to keep working with farmers, allowing them to use new technologies, allowing them to take on, use new tools as we progress. Because that's the only way that we're going to actually get solutions on the ground, is if we work with farmers rather than against them.
Thank you, Blaire. Over to you, Gillian, for the next question.
Thank you, Joanna. The next question, will you commit to ending bottom trawling, doubling the number of wetlands, and increase funding for a Jobs for Nature style scheme? Oceans, wetlands and forests store carbon and play a key role in mitigating the impacts of extreme weather. So I think we're back to starting with Damien.
Yeah, look, thank you very much. And the bottom trawling issue has been quite topical in the Hauraki Gulf, where we're trying to improve the environmental outcomes from fishing there. We're not banning it, but we are moving to try and reduce the impacts of it, and encouraging and funding actually alternative systems. If we have precision seafood harvesting as one of those areas where hopefully we can encourage the industry to move to a lower impact fishing system. On doubling the number of wetlands, we've put in place protection for existing wetlands, and some farmers are creating them themselves as a sink for some of the nitrates from their farm systems. We need to ensure that they get some acknowledgement and credit for that through either sequestration and over time, hopefully for biodiversity credits. It's something that has been talked of. If we can work internationally to create viable, credible credits for biodiversity, I think we will all be better off. And I think that's the direction of travel. Jobs for Nature was, of course, something that was created off the back of COVID. That situation, ensuring that there were jobs for people, but we've seen huge value in that. We need to ensure that where we've had effective progress, such as in the area of wilding pines, that we continue to fund that accordingly. But there is a squeeze on funding, and not all of those Jobs for Nature projects will continue beyond the life of that COVID funding, but we've got to pick up the good ones and carry on.
Thank you, Damien.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Gillian.
That's all right. Blaire, thank you.
Sure. So wetlands obviously are great and are great for carbon sequestration as well. And so our agriculture policy does recognise the carbon sequestration properties of wetlands and recognises that and encourages farmers landowners to take that up. On the issue of bottom trawling, no, we're not going to ban bottom trawling. There are some issues with that we will have to work around for the future, but that's not our policy at all. And as far as the Jobs for Nature style scheme, no, that is not something we'll be producing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blaire. And Steve.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. So we have announced, the Greens have announced our oceans policy, so having an oceans commissioner and basically by 2030 having 30% of our marine area in some sort of protection. And yes, absolutely phasing out bottom trawling. I don't know if anybody knows, but back in the 70s, there actually used to be a reef seamount out in Tasman Bay that got trawled out by a fishing company here in Nelson. And then they wondered why fish stocks went down. Seamounts and the areas that are bottom trawled traditionally are areas of the greatest biodiversity. It's where fish go to breed. And so it's essential that actually, if you want to keep any sort of fishing industry, that you protect breeding areas, and that's what bottom trawling doesn't do. It destroys breeding areas. So, and also halting any further degradation of marine and estuarine habitats through extraction or destructive fishing practices. And as for land use, protecting soil health and preventing loss are key focuses, and ensuring that land use aligns with the urgency of climate change mitigation. So yes, more wetlands, but looking at what land is and encouraging and helping landowners to move land that is marginal or erosion prone into reserve planted, so to increase biodiversity and obviously sequestering carbon as well, and including community-based sort of biodiversity conservation initiatives with land planting. I mean, the Muteri catchment and the Motueka catchment organisations that have been run through Tasman Environmental Trust are really great examples of that kind of community involvement. And I know the Muteri catchment here where I am, over the last 3 years, nearly 400,000 trees have been planted on private land with the help of that funding, and then also with funding from landowners as well. And that's a huge outcome and an amazing biodiversity. And mostly it's on stream edges and wetland restoration. And now TDC has a global consent for constructing wetlands, so making it easier for landowners as well. Thank you.
It's about 2 minutes, Steve. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, well, one last question from the set list before we move to the participants' questions, which are piling up in the chat box. And this last question from the set list is, what will you do to ensure all children leave school with an adequate science-based understanding of climate change and ecosystems? And we will start with Blaire.
Sure. So I would hazard a guess that young people these days that have been graduating from schools do have a pretty good science-backed understanding of climate change. And I'd say that it's probably people from your generation rather than my generation that sometimes lack the science-based understanding of climate change. One of the things that I am worried about in schools, though, is that a lot of kids, by the time that they get into those more complex subjects, once they get to high school, is that a lot of them still don't have those basic fundamentals like reading, writing, that they need to understand those more complex subjects when they get further on in their education, and that's why you'll see that our education policy is really focused on making sure that kids get those skills in reading and writing, making sure that kids are taught using phonics to read instead of this other approach where you look at the first letter of a word and look at the pictures and guess what the word might be from the context, which is just not an effective way to read. Phonics works for almost all kids, and we need to make sure that's how we're teaching kids to read in schools, so that when we do get to the more sort of advanced science topics later on, which you need to be able to read and write in order to be able to comprehend, it's really important that we get those basic fundamentals right. And I would say that that's actually the biggest issue in our education system right now, and that's what our policy is designed around.
Thank you. On to Steve.
Yep, thanks. So I absolutely agree with you, Blaire, that reading and writing and numeracy from the beginning is absolutely core to any learning, but that also science is at the base of the Green Party policy. So if the science says that phonics is the best way to learn to read and write, or to read, then that's absolutely the way we should be doing it. And if we're not doing it that way, then it needs to change. So I totally agree with that. But also that the system should foster lifelong learning not in children, but in everybody, and to develop the skills they need to participate fully in the society as we transition to a lower carbon economy or a lower carbon future. And so providing advice and support on the implementation of the full breadth of the national curriculum in a local context, including the science of the climate. And it doesn't, you do need to be able to read, and that those core values are vital, but kids also need to know that they're in a changing world. And so establishing a unit in the Ministry of Education that supports schools and the system to listen to and respond to the voices of children is really important. And also lowering the voting age to 16. I think that's really important because lots of youth are aware of the climate problem, but feel disempowered and unheard.
Thank you, Steve. And Damien. Unmute, Damien.
Here we are. Sorry, my apology. Look, the world that kids are coming into is far different from the one that was even in place 10 years ago. And so all these things are evolving. Artificial intelligence is one of those challenges. The kids have access to a whole lot of information. What they sometimes lack is inspiration and understanding why. And I think that's what we have to do in the education system, is clearly give the kids a reason to study, to read, learn to read and write, and then some of the basic tools, and make sure that we have actually food in schools for some of them. Without proper food and nourishment and some support, those kids are not going to learn, no matter how much you force them into a classroom for 3 hours. And so continuing with the rollout of food in schools and other support systems for teachers, I think is really important. giving the kids a reason why they learn all of these things, including science, I think is really important. Blaire's right that most of the kids probably do appreciate that climate change is something they need to learn more about, but where they fit into that and what they can do is something that we should be helping them with through the education system. I do support the voting age of 16. I think sometimes the conversations I have with 16, 17-year-olds is far more comprehensive and inquisitive than I get at some of the older age gatherings that I go to. But look, science is one part of a wide-ranging curriculum that is very, very busy. We just have to make sure that the kids are skilled for the challenges of all life ahead of them, climate change being one of them.
Thank you, Damien. Okay, so we will now move to participants' questions. And Gillian, would you like to begin by selecting one of the questions participants have written into chat and posing it?
Yep, thank you. I've forgotten who's first up.
It'd be Steve. Steve would be first up.
First up, right, okay. This question has been put by more than one person, but I'll just pick this particular version. Given that public conservation land is the biggest storehouse for terrestrial carbon, would you support the policy of cutting DOC funding that cares for these areas? And I note that national policy is to reduce Department of Conservation funding by 6.5%. So, Steve.
No, so we wouldn't reduce funding for DOC. We would increase funding for DOC. The areas of research that DOC do, particularly around biodiversity, are hugely important. There are areas where their mandate, if you like, could be changed. I know that I noticed in the chat there's some other questions about hunting, and if we're going to have a predator-free Aotearoa by 2050, then we have to look at all pests, and that includes things like trout, which I know is hugely controversial, but actually DOC are still breeding trout. Go figure. They're a pest species, and deer and goats and pigs are well known to be destroying bush and releasing carbon as well. So there's plenty of room for DOC to do a whole lot more. The wildling pine thing that Damien suggested earlier, that's another huge issue that if the money's stopped now, then the problem just comes back. So you have to, if you're going to fix something, you have to actually go to the end of fixing it.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, Damien?
Look, thank you. And we have increased DOC's baseline funding every year that we've been in, but we have taken a slice just recently to try and ensure that we meet fiscal obligations of balancing the books in 2027. But I would not support, and we don't support cutting baseline funding other than that latest move. There is huge pressure, as we know. And the Jobs for Nature, of course, projects put a huge amount of additional funding in. A lot of progress was made. Some of that will come to an end, as I said before. We have to ensure that the baseline continues, and it will never be enough. And we do have to come up with innovative ways of keeping pests down. And I think encouraging hunters out there not to farm the deer, but actually get rid of them. The goats, the deer and goats are growing in numbers to the point where you're having to avoid them on the roads, literally. And so we need to work with the hunting fraternity to get them out and to help us control a number of those things. But no, we don't support a cut.
Thank you. Blaire?
I would suggest that DOC needs some reform. And I think if you have any dealings with DOC, that you would recognise that there are some inefficiencies there. And that's where we're looking to make those 6.5% of cuts, and that is, you know, when all of the reductions that we're asking the public service to do is in recognition of the fact that every New Zealander has seen examples of that wasteful spending in the public service, and we have that policy to reduce that spending by 6.5%, focusing on the, that back office stuff, the bureaucrats in Wellington that have had you know, a lot of them on big pay, and a lot more hirings come in basically every single government agency without better results. And I, you know, DOC is one example of that. I would like to see, you know, I'm hoping to get into government. I'm hoping to spend some time with government, and I would absolutely be supportive of increased DOC funding in the future. But I do think we need to make the public service more efficient and stop some of that wasteful spending before we start moving in that direction. And I would say that the best way that we can guarantee that DOC will get increased funding in the future is if we get the economy moving and we generate economic growth, so that then we will have more tax revenue that we can then give to DOC to roll out their programs for biodiversity and other areas.
Got
Okay, shall I pose the next question? It really follows on from the last question, in which two of the candidates, Steve and Damien, referred to the issue of preserving some exotic species so people can hunt and fish. But one questioner wanted to be pointed about this, and so I'll put this question to Blaire, who the questioner points out that National announced that it supports the rights of New Zealanders to continue to hunt and fish while protecting and enhancing our natural environment, and points out that this doesn't make sense to the questioner, in that some of the browsing animals and the exotic fish interfere with natural biodiversity. Blaire didn't comment on that aspect, and I'll put that question right to you, Blaire.
Yeah, so our hunting and fishing policy recognises that there are a significant amount of New Zealanders that enjoy recreational hunting and fishing. For a lot of people, that's a big part of being a Kiwi, is being able to go into the bush to go fishing and to go hunting. And our policy recognise that, absolutely. We support, protecting New Zealand's native species, promoting native biodiversity as well. But we think we can do that in a way while we also protect that right of New Zealanders to enjoy recreational hunting and fishing as well.
And although Steve and Damien have made some comments on that, do you want to add to that?
Other than that, I don't think we need to support. I've never said that we should support a population of deer or goats. If we could eliminate them, that would be great. We attempted to do that, of course, when we started farming deer, but we didn't quite get there, and the numbers have ballooned out again. The same with goats when we were capturing them. You know, they are in numbers that are really hammering our native flora, and we need to get in there. But as I say, I don't want to be naive to say we can eradicate them. We need to really hammer them to get the numbers right down.
Thank you. Steve, do you want to comment on that?
Only to say, if we want to, if predator-free New Zealand 2050 is actually an aspiration, then it does mean we have to get rid of all the pests, and maybe even bringing cats into that as well. Wild cats particularly are a huge problem for our native birds, but it's more about the destruction that the goats and pigs and deer make, particularly pigs, with turning the soil over and releasing carbon from the soil. And so, yeah, we have to really, the numbers are, when I was in Greymouth last week, incredible, seeing goats pretty much right in town. And I know that it's happening in Nelson as well, coming off the hills and into the back of Nelson. And if it's not DOC that does that, and then who is it? Because private hunters are not they're not able to shoot that close to town. It has to be regulated in some way. But yeah, it needs serious attention.
Thank you. Thank you all. Over to you, Gillian.
Okay. There's a question here about different parties' climate policies. I'm going to just abbreviate it. How would you work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030? And particularly given your potential coalition partners. I've forgotten who starts again. I think it might be Steve. Steve, yeah.
Well, yeah. So, like I said right at the beginning, that we have to do everything really. So it's not just transport and changing the modes of transport and the types of vehicles we have. It's not just reducing animal numbers and reducing artificial fertilizers. Although, as Damien said, that's 48% of our emissions, so that's got to be a big one. We've got to, if we could halve the number of animals, that's going to be somewhere close to 25% of our emissions. We've got to do everything because it's a huge ask, and it doesn't happen if you're still also putting more material through the economy, which is what a growth economy does. So we really need to be looking at how the economy runs. There's plenty of money. We don't need to grow. We just need to redistribute the money that we've got. And we can do that through a different sort of taxation where there's a tax on capital. So if you're making a lot of money by buying and selling houses, for example, you actually pay tax on that money that you make. And so that's, we have to do everything, having more solar panels, using less energy is the main thing, actually doing less, and as individuals, flying less, buying less, all of those things actually reduce our carbon, our climate impact.
Thank you. Damien.
Look, I don't advocate for halving the number of animals. That might be a simple policy, but it's a bit like halving the cars tomorrow. There are ways that we can move more astutely in the direction of lowering emissions with technology, and it doesn't necessarily require GMO or GE. I think we have to think global and act local, and that is less of things. And it might be less time in the shower and less time online. I make those quips to my daughters who scoff at it. But actually, if everyone did that, and everyone just goes online thinking there's no global impact on that, we are kidding ourselves. This has an impact on the climate, the energy used to run things like this. And so there's a hell of a lot more of it happening, and there's more impact on the climate. So less applies to everything, not just to certain sectors that are conveniently located somewhere else. And so, I think the awareness that we are seeing through young kids, or it might be around some areas, they sometimes don't realize that personally they can do their little bit as well.
Thank you, Damien. Blaire.
Look, Damien just talked about taking shorter showers, and the government spent more than $20 million advertising that on an advertising campaign for New Zealanders to do that. Look, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis.
That's a ridiculous thing. 20 million on shorter showers.
Yeah. Well,
keep it honest, mate.
You ran a campaign. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We need to cut wasteful government spending, yet the government was pushing ahead with that policy to take shorter showers. And I would say that's not
policy. Someone suggested it. Well, I have seen.
I would say that's not having a big impact on New Zealanders day to day at the moment. Going back to the question, which is about how we're going to meet our climate change goals, we are absolutely 100% committed to doing that. Christopher Luxon has made it one of his 8 pledges to New Zealand on his pledge cards that we will meet our climate change goals The difference is that we're looking at practical solutions to do that, and I would argue completely against the Green Party's idea that we need to shrink our economy in order to do that. We don't. We can have economic growth and we can meet our climate change targets. In fact, embracing new technologies is going to create new economic opportunities for us, and we will be taking those into the future, benefiting our economy at the same time we get our emissions down and meet those goals. I'm campaigning for the National Party to get the strongest party vote possible, because we have a great team of blue-greens within the National Party, like myself, that are really driving for some really strong climate action, as you've seen in our policies to double New Zealand's renewable energy generation, roll out EV infrastructure across the country, and then working on getting our transport, agriculture and industry emissions down as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Blaire. Sorry, Gillian, I keep cutting across you.
That's all right.
But I can follow up where we've got to in that spirited little exchange by sheeting the next question home to Blaire. The questioner on chat directs it to Blaire, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit, that you, the National Party, will not be able to meet its climate goals if it builds all the roads that it says it wants to build. And how does this fit with the imperative to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030?
Yeah, my response would be that EVs use roads. We're absolutely pushing for that transition to electric vehicles. We're talking about getting food to market as well. There's no viable solution for getting apples from Tasman to the port on bikes or walking. We need to have trucks transporting those. We need to have really good world-class infrastructure to do that. If you look at all the countries in the world that have really good biking infrastructure, walking infrastructure, they also have really good roads. And we don't in New Zealand, and so we need to catch up, get that right, at the same time that we really.
They also have a whole lot higher tax rate than we do as well, than you're proposing.
Well, look, Damien, as I've said multiple times during this conversation, we don't have a taxation problem at the moment. We have a spending problem, and there's been countless examples of your government just wasting taxpayers' money in ways that meant there's now really tight budgets for some of the other things that we're going to do, because so much has been wasted.
We'll allow Steve and Damien to. We'll allow Steve and Damien to comment on this question, that building, and I think it's Labour Party policy too, to build a lot of new roads will not fit with the imperative to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. So we'll ask Damien to respond, and then Steve.
Most of the road funding is actually for maintenance and upgrading. As I say, they have been degraded and they are dangerous. We need to ensure that we have safe systems of transportation. That's where most of our money, we put a huge amount into public transport, into cycling as well. And we have a budget that balances. We know where the money is coming from, and we're still yet to see from National where they will fill the holes in their budget. And I suspect that it might be increase in GST, sale of assets, or something that they have not yet announced, as they did in 2000.
Absolute nonsense. It's got a fully costed policy. Stop speculating on things that you don't know about.
Listen to The Economist, Blaire. There's $2 billion gap.
Okay, let's go to Steve on whether building a lot of new roads is compatible with reaching our climate targets.
Absolutely not. We've got enough roads. They may need maintenance, and sure, spend money on maintaining them, but we do not need any. What we need is less cars on them. And then there's room for the trucks that Blaire wants to get the goods to port. It's important. But if we got people out of their cars and onto buses or working closer to home, I'm proud to say that I've walked to work for the last 32 years. Never driven to work. The fact that I live here is beside the point, really.
Yeah.
But that was
Lucky you.
an
Yeah.
active choice, was to live close to where I work. You know, if you choose to live in Motueka and work in Nelson, well, then you should have to take the bus or pay the price of getting that
They
distance.
can't afford to live in Nelson.
Well, then there's something wrong with the housing system, and somebody
There
should be
is.
taxing.
Yeah, we agree on that. Yeah.
Taxing capital on the house prices, which the Greens are going to do. So there's no place for new roads. If we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% in the next 7 years, the building the road in itself is a hugely carbon intensive. The concrete, the tar seal, the breaking the rocks, the trucks, all of that is hugely carbon. And then there's more cars, because that's what roads do. They encourage cars. If you spend that money on cycleways, on active transport, and on public transport, we'll be much closer towards meeting that goal.
Thank you, Steve. Over to Gillian.
Just picking up on that transport issue. If your party is part of the future government, can you guarantee that the Nelson Tasman area can continue to enjoy the fantastic new e-bus system at highly subsidised fares? You're welcome to generalise a little bit from that question and talk about your support for subsidised public transport. And I think, Steve, you're up first.
So, yeah, sure. The Green Party would definitely continue the bus. I'd like to see it having more stops and running in the weekends. I mean, obviously, I live out in Tasman, and so you still can't get to Nelson in the weekend. And there's but it is constricted by population. So getting people to be, if we're going to have any development in housing, that's along the bus routes. So that's the Motueka Coastal Highway, Tasman, Mapua. But at the moment, there's no stops for that bus anywhere between when it leaves Mapua and it gets to Richmond. So actually all of that, Mahana Hills and Appleby, you can't catch the bus because there's no bus stops. So more bus stops, more buses, absolutely. And including this service going through Upper Muteri. Because once people realise that there is a service, I mean, in lots of countries in the world, if you lived within 5 minutes walk of a bus stop, you'd be thrilled. You know, if you had a bus stop outside your house, you'd be thrilled. But people around in Nelson and Tasman are up in arms because they've got a bus stop outside their house. And it's just that we haven't caught up with the 21st century. You know, there's so many people who just want their car to be parked on their road, and actually it's all of our road. It's not, there could be no car parking on the road, and that would be perfectly reasonable because it's everybody's road. You know, it's not your private car park.
Thank you. Damien?
I'll just check that on. Oh, yeah. Look, our planning laws have been disastrous and have allowed us to spread out and basically end up with inefficient everything. And so we do need to, and that's why we've reformed the RMA to allow more creative development, more infill housing, allowing Auckland to go up, not out. And the same should apply, as I said before, to some kind of village development concept in Tasman. This is a high growth area. We need to develop those concepts so that we can have efficient. Yes, we've committed to subsidise and fund the bus system, but over time they must become viable. Otherwise, they're subject to the whims of politicians and governments that come and go. And we don't want that. If we're to build up confidence in a public transport system, there has to be ongoing commitment to that, and it has to be as sustainable as possible, and that will include the things that Steve has mentioned, development that take into account public transport and better systems, but at the moment it's just not possible. So it would be nice to expand it out, but if we're to travel, 3 or 4 kilometres in a big bus, for one passenger, you know, that it's a very marginal gain to the environment, I'd suggest. So we really have to make it, you know, get the economies of scale, get the concentration of population so that this can all work properly.
Thank you. And Blaire.
Yep, I'll get to the question in a second. I just want to correct something I said before, because I apologise for scrolling through my phone a little bit. I was just looking up the official figures. So it was $2.8 million that the Labor government spent on their Shorter Showers advertising campaign. So I just wanted to correct my mistake earlier. But that was the actual amount, 2.8 million. Sorry about that, Damien. Still, in my opinion, a big example of wasteful government spending in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Going back to the question, the public transport, the e-bus system, I think the councils have done a really good job with getting that underway. And having that public transport system for Nelson and Tasman. As you know, we are going to end the Community Connect program when we get into government, because we want to give people back more of what they earn and then let them decide if they spend it on public transport. For the average, couple on an average income, it's going to be $150 back a fortnight, and I would hazard a guess that that will more than cover their public transport fares in the first place. So while we will be ending some of those direct subsidies to people to pay for their public transport, we'll still be continuing to fund our public transport as a government. You know, the government does subsidise a lot of local councils with their public transport. That will continue under national, but we'll be giving people more back of what they earn in our tax relief package, and then they'll be able to spend that themselves on their public transport and still have some left over to pay for the groceries.
I believe that when I see it. Hopefully not.
Joanna, I think we have probably covered most of the questions in chat.
There is one more that's a different question, Gillian, and I would love to just have a quick go at that, and I think we have just time to get that in as well as closing, but I'll have to ask candidates to be pretty brief about it. It's a difficult and bothersome question, but I haven't heard it discussed much at all yet, so I want to put it. It comes from a Mohua Golden Bay member, that carbon emission offsetting schemes all over the world, on the basis of evidence that's being produced quite recently, are found to be deeply flawed, and the questioner says we should no longer rely on this to reduce our emissions. Therefore, says the questioner, will you commit to do everything in your power to make sure that our country realistically reduces emissions in ways that you have already discussed? And I take it that she means relying much less on offsetting by particularly by plantation forests. You had this is a question that clearly involves a lot of thought and possibly looking at the recent research. And I realize I'm asking you sort of quick answers, but it's an important one and deserves at least a few minutes. So let us go to Damien first on this difficult question.
I mean, clearly there's growing wisdom, I guess, around the reality that you can't just offset everything and then just carry on as we are. We have to have gross emissions reduction. That's the only thing that's really going to have a more immediate impact on global warming. And so, but offsets are, it's helpful. And until we have the technologies in some areas, such as transportation, we can't lock people off from their far now from their families and say you shouldn't travel to see them. And until there's an alternative zero emissions policy or technology, then those things will occur. So is an offset better than nothing? Yes, it is. So we'll continue to have offsets, but we cannot rely on them to do that. Although, at Paris there was a proposal put 4 parts per thousand. That is, if we could increase the carbon content of the soil across the globe by 4 parts per thousand, we would be offsetting the emissions that we put into the atmosphere. Now, I'm no scientist and I'm no mathematician. That was the proposition put forward. There's still some focus on that. New Zealand has relatively high levels of carbon in our soil, but we can increase them. In other countries like Africa and in Australia, there's huge potential to increase the carbon content of soil. And if that's one way of, I guess, of sequestering and offsetting, and it does amount to that quantum, then we should be further investigating it. We can't afford to turn our back on any of the offsetting or the gross emissions reduction technologies that might be before us.
Thanks, Damien. Blaire.
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, as we all know, the world doesn't, you know, really care where the carbon emissions come from, or where they're sequestered, as long as we make progress globally on it. And but when we're looking at those carbon offsets, we absolutely need to be 100% certain that we're making a difference in doing it. And that's why it's even more important that we get our own emissions down here in New Zealand. That's why we need to get our transport emissions down. It's why we need to get our agricultural emissions down. It's why we need to get our industry emissions down. And that's why we have a plan to really focus on doing that. And I'll be happy to have a look at that article and things as we after this.
Thank you, Blaire. Steve.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Damien. It's the gross emissions reduction that we need. It doesn't. You shouldn't be able to pay to just carry on emitting. I mean, there are other forms of regulation that could be used, like a personal tradable carbon permit, for example, which hasn't really, it's got some traction around the world, but it hasn't raised its head here, where every individual gets a carbon ration that they can use or trade. But then actually what that does is gives the government the opportunity to lower that every year, because humans by their nature will take it to the limit every time. And so unless there's actually some regulation which is saying this year it's 9% less than last year, is 9% less than the following year, we need some structure which actually is going to reduce it by 9% a year. And the emissions trading scheme doesn't do that. It just lets emitters keep emitting as long as they're making money. And that's not actually getting us where we need to go.
Thank you, Steve. And that is indeed the last question. And Gillian and I will make very brief comments on this discussion. I must say I've been pretty happy that some ideas that don't normally appear in debate have been introduced into this debate. We have heard from candidates that we must cut material throughput to achieve our goals, and in other words, a planned degrowth. And we've also heard that countered by saying growth is good, and the insistence that we can decarbonize and grow at the same time, on which others throw great doubt. But it's very important that this matter is out there and being debated. We've heard the introduction of a very interesting idea of village development, counter to urban sprawl. We've heard the idea of carbon rationing introduced, and we've heard candidates express taking seriously the figure that comes out of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, that it is 9% a year that we have to go down, which is really a major matter a major challenge to all of us. This has been a good debate with good ideas shared and counted and reshared. So thank you very much, candidates, for participating in this And I'll ask Gillian to make a few summary comments too.
Gillian, Joanna, can I just have one comment? Rob Sugart here. I was one of the first questions, and it is completely circumnavigated. That was my question about the national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity. And is there a reason for completely circumnavigating that question?
No, there isn't. We couldn't fit all the questions in, and other questions have also had the bad luck not to be asked.
I reminded you because I was one of the first ones, and the whole national policy statement of Indigenous biodiversity has not gained a lot of traction tonight, and I thought it was a good opportunity to actually pay some attention to that one. But anyway, if that is beside the questions that could be raised, then then so be it.
Yeah, sorry about that. I imagine there are other questioners who wish their questions had been asked, and I've been left in the same position
No, that was
myself.
the second question, and you didn't pay much attention to it. But anyway, that is your choice.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to Gillian.
Well, thank you to the candidates. I think each of you's brought some really interesting things forward on a wide range of subjects. I've been interested in the policies or your positions on carbon sequestration through use of new technologies on farms and in farming practices, and almost all of you have been supportive of protection and development of wetlands, and I think also acknowledging the role of soil on farms and in forests in sequestering carbon. So I think that's been encouraging. I think there's a challenge to change behaviour, and whether that be short showers or taking buses or riding cycles, that's changes that are going to have to be made by us all in time, and it's good to see the different perspectives from each of your positions on how you're going to support that behaviour change that's necessary to make some inroads into our climate problems that we've got. Yeah, that's I think it's been very interesting. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to Steve and Damien and Blaire. Very sincerely, we know that you have a pretty furiously rushed schedule at this time of the year, and we're grateful that you managed to talk to us. This has been recorded. It'll be on the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum website pretty soon, and judging on previous election Meet the Candidates events, it'll be much used. I expect it may gain hundreds of users before the election. So with those thanks, I'll ask Gillian to close with a karakia.
Ia tau kia tātou katoa, te ao te araha me te marutau, Tihei Moriora. May peace, love and safety be upon us all. Tihei Moriora. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks to participants.
Thanks very much, Joanna and Gillian. Really good. Cheers.
Thanks, Blaire.